I'm going to introduce our speaker. My name is, by the way, is Martha Cole. I'm the program manager for our outreach and education program, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker tonight. You're here for Iron Dreams, Montana and the Pacific Railroad Surveys of 1853. And our speaker is Austin Haney, who's a historian specializing in the American and Canadian West. A lifelong Montanan and graduate of the University of Montana, he's spent the last several years sharing stories with the National Park Service, Blaine County Museum, Lewis and Clark Foundation, Fort Missoula, and many others. And we are absolutely thrilled that he decided to come down and share some stories with us tonight. So please welcome Austin Haney.
So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you all for coming out to this program. It's an incredible honor to be here and speak about something that's really been a historical dream of mine since I first discovered it several years ago. A little background on my own journey with the Stevens Expedition is this painting right here. I remember seeing this as a kid who grew up west of Great Falls. The Rocky Mountain front, that has been my morning, my evening for most of my life. This is a scene that I know well. I can close my eyes and I can be there. So imagine my surprise when, growing up in the Great Falls area, everyone talks about Lewis and Clark. Pretty much everybody in Montana talks about Lewis and Clark. So imagine my surprise when I find out about this expedition that I'd never heard about. And I'm curious, just with a show of hands, how many of you guys before tonight had ever heard of the Stevens Expedition? Wow. Evidently, I was living under a rock. Speaking of rocks, but this painting depicts the expedition actually in the foothills of the Rockies just west of modern Great Falls. And this really is what got me going on trying to discover more about the story of this expedition that's really been forgotten in a lot of ways in Montana history. So without further ado, let's venture. So America in the 1850s is a nation on the move. Of course, some of you folks might remember or know what this is. The Oregon Trail, fun little video game in the 80s, by the way. So America's relationship with the West by 1853, it's about 50 years since the Louisiana Purchase. You have a steady stream of expeditions early on. Lewis and Clark, of course, Zebulon Pike, a couple others in the Jeffersonian era. But for the next 30, 40 years, by and large, it's pretty small scale, and it's largely to the south and west of where we are at right now. But beginning in the 1840s, you have a lot of people migrating to the west, to California, to Oregon. By 1840, you've got maybe 25,000 or so American citizens living beyond the Missouri River. Of course, things start rapidly changing, what with the Oregon Trail, what with everything going on in the 1840s. Another big thing is the Mexican-American War. 1846 through 1848, the United States seizes the northern third of Mexico, adding the southwest to the country. At the same time, you also have the settlement of the Oregon question. There had been this great debate, joint occupation with Great Britain, but by the 1840s, it's American now. So coming right on the heels of all of this, you have the California gold rush, and that trickle becomes a flood. By 1853, you have nearly 500,000 people living in that same region that had once held only 25,000. And that's all fine and dandy for the United States. You have the economic benefits of the California gold rush. You have the agricultural and ecological products that can come from the West. But what good is all these riches and this bounty if you can't control it? This is partly why Mexico lost that chunk of territory. It was far away, the transportation was not good, very easy to lose if you don't have a firm grip on it. And what really solidifies economic power and economic control? It's all about shrinking down your transportation time. If you can connect things better, that's how you're going to really make the most of your situation. And of course, in the 1850s, the best way to do this is a railroad. You can get to the West by wagon. You can get to the West by ship. But the fastest that will take you is 6 months. And along the way, well, what do they say in the Oregon Trail video game, right? You've died of dysentery. And if you take the ship route, you might die of malaria in Panama, which is just as awful, if not worse, than dysentery. I don't want either of them. I don't think you guys do either. So, we have a railroad. That's the idea that we need. Representative James Denver in Congress simply says that the Pacific Railroad is no longer a question for debate. It is a matter of necessity conceded by everyone. So, we're all in agreement. We need a Pacific Railroad. There's only one problem, and it's certainly not one that we can relate to in 2024 America. See, in the 1850s, Americans really don't like each other. They don't get along. America is a nation not only on the move literally, but figuratively. They are moving apart. And the big issue all ties back to slave states versus free. Think of it this way. The North and South, they've been locked in a power struggle for decades at this point, and the railroad is only going to exacerbate the problem. All this territory in the West, great. The people in the East start setting their eyes on it and wanting to make it their own. The Southern states wish to see the West be more slave states. The Northern states wish to see it be free states. And a lot of issues are going to happen because of this. Think of it this way. If we only have one transcontinental railroad, who's going to reap the benefits of the West? Whoever has the eastern terminus. So it's all about economics, it's all about control and the political power that comes with it. So enter onto the stage a very interesting figure in American history. He's one of the most underappreciated presidents and most unknown. He consistently ranks in the bottom 5. But I hope by the end of this program you will agree with me that he deserves to be lifted back to his rightful place in the pantheon of American heroes, somewhere in the bottom 6. Franklin Pierce. He very, I don't know if astutely or famously or infamously is the right term for it, but he very much is gung-ho about this idea of Western expansion. He says in his inaugural address, "The policy of my administration will not be controlled by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion." Really interesting speaker, that Franklin. So, a little background on Franklin Pierce. They elect him in 1852 quite simply because he's the guy they hate the least. There's not enough the Northerners dislike about him to not elect him, and there's not enough that the Southerners dislike about him to not elect him. And he's not Winfield Scott. So, congratulations, Franklin, you're now President of the United States. He's known as a very affable fellow, has a lot of friends from a lot of different places, and he rewards them with positions in his administration. One of the most important being this fellow, if you know your Civil War history, you're going to recognize this guy right away. This is Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, soon to be the President of the Confederate States. It's only going to take 8 years, but it's amazing what happens. So, Pierce is very much interested in this idea of a transcontinental railroad, and he puts Davis and the War Department in charge of the project. Now, of course, what's the fair way to decide where we're going to put this one transcontinental railroad? Well, we can't upset the Northerners by putting it purely in the South just right away, and we can't do the opposite. So we're going to send out not 1, not 2, or 3. We're going to send out 5 different surveys to find the best route, and we will choose the most fair one of all. That sounds correct, right? That's fair. That's equal. So, in this era of sectional crisis, we're going to get a northern railroad survey. We're going to get a central survey. One up the coast to connect Oregon and California, and 2 southern surveys, because that's fair. So, in walks the protagonist of our story. I can't exactly call him a hero. I can't exactly call him a villain. But he is a character nonetheless. Isaac Ingalls Stevens. He's a very interesting character, stands all of 5'3" in his boots. I don't know if that had anything to do with his personality, but he's got a bit of a Napoleon complex. He is a real go-ahead man, admired by a lot of people, and a very good supporter of Franklin Pierce. And because of this support of our dear beloved Franklin, Stevens is rewarded with the cushy posting as Washington Territory's first governor. So, Isaac, you have to go all the way to the West Coast anyway. Want to survey a railroad along the way? So Stevens is the governor of Washington, the railroad surveyor, and he's also the Indian commissioner, all in one. Do we sense that maybe he's going to have some conflicts of interest coming up in the future? That's foreshadowing. So Stevens is very gung-ho about this idea of a Pacific Railroad, particularly a northern one. He's good friends with a certain Illinois senator by the name of Stephen Douglas, who's also a big proponent of a northern railroad, and also a buddy of Pierce who's going to get him in some trouble later down the line. But he is definitely a big supporter of this Pacific Railroad, and a natural choice. But he's so much of a go-ahead man, he's called the young man in a hurry for a reason. Before Davis even officially hires him, he starts assembling his expedition and buying supplies and making plans. Davis is not happy about this. Davis doesn't like this go-getter who can be a bit pushy. So Stevens rushes up to this lovely little hilltop right here. If you've ever flown into the Minneapolis airport, you have flown right over this thing. Camping right outside the fort at a site that's now under the runway. Stevens starts assembling his expedition. He's going to lead the northernmost survey. So most of these railroad surveys, by the way, number about 30 to 50 individuals. Stevens hires 240. Yeah, a real go-ahead man. So coming forward to Fort Snelling, this is the gateway to the Northwest as far as the Northwest goes. This is sort of the headquarters for this section of operation in the United States at the time, and it's a very good place to draw supplies. So, setting out from the Twin Cities, Stevens has quite the prairie circus going on. Again, 240 men. He's got, in that 240, multiple parts. He has Métis cart drivers bringing up baggage. He has an escort of dragoons. Who's heard of dragoons before? Excellent. Just to give you an idea of how goofy this would have looked, dragoons in the 1850s, you know, in the Nutcracker, those hats, the shakos, the real big tall ones with the brims. Dragoons wore those. They were blue and bright orange. Imagine the sight of a group of dragoons and all these guys going down the plains with their little orange hats and things like that. So in addition to the escort, in addition to the cart drivers, he's got a couple different plans. There's more than one component of this survey. He's got his main force coming west from Minnesota, but he's also got a force from the west coming east. The plan is they're going to meet at the spine of the Rocky Mountains, somewhere on the Continental Divide. In charge of this western detachment is a young captain by the name of George B. McClellan. They did not get along. McClellan was not a fan of this idea. He said that politics and surveys do not mix, and called it a grand barbecue. Believe it or not, barbecue was a term back then. So in addition to the Western Party under our dear barbecuing McClellan, we also have a river party coming up on a steamboat that will meet Stevens and the rest of the party at Fort Union, and we'll get to that in a bit. So the North Dakota Plains are sort of this trial period. They have groups staying with the main train, about 100 or so men at any time. They're moving pretty slow. They also have an odometer wagon with them that's bringing up the rear. So if you guys don't know what an odometer wagon is, every time the wheel turns, it clicks, and you record the number of clicks. If you know the circumference of your wheel, you multiply that by the number of rotations of the wheel, bada bing, bada boom, you have your mileage. They were really good at math, these surveyors. But in addition to the shakedown cruise, I forgot to mention, do you guys know what is right here at the bottom right of the screen? What does it look like?
She said a donut.
Well, I guess you'd call it a donut. A raft. They brought with them 2 inflatable rubber rafts. Bet you didn't know they had those in the 1850s. So again, shakedown cruise, it's places people have been before. There are a lot of well-worn Red River cart trails leading out from Minnesota into the Manitoba and Dakota Plains. Really, the main adventure is going to come after they get past the Missouri Coteau. That's the last portion of the Northern Plains that the U.S. had sent any government expedition out to. See, by the time they get to Fort Union, they are really in uncharted territory beyond that. Lewis and Clark were the only, well, they were the first and the only ones to that point sent out into what's now Montana. All these other expeditions in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, they don't touch Montana. So again, it's been 50 years. There's a lot to find out. Just a quick aside on the art. For any of you artistically minded folks, I know I'm big into visuals, but most of the art in this program is done by John McStanley. He was a professional painter from Detroit that Stevens hired to come along on the journey to paint and take daguerreotype photographs. So Fort Union, like I said, it's really the gateway into the unknown. Whereas Snelling sort of functions as this soft gate into the Northwest, from Fort Union on out, this is really where the unknown begins, at least as far as Euro-Americans are concerned. Again, exploration, discovery, I have a tough time with that because they're really not discovering anything. They're just the ones that are writing it down, which is really important, and that's what I think it really needs to be remembered for. But tangents aside, Fort Union, they come into contact with a couple people who are really going to be super important for the journey ahead. Because beyond Fort Union, you start getting more and more into the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And if you are going into Blackfoot country in the mid-19th century, there are 2 people that you really want on your side. Alexander and Nottowixsa Culbertson. They are effectively the king and queen of the upper Missouri. They know everybody, they have all the connections. You aren't going to get far without their help or advice. So continuing on into what is now eastern Montana, they're following the Missouri River and take a beeline up along the Milk River. They're following this thing called the Fur Traders Express. So for any of you who know your fur trade history, Fort Union, Fort Benton, they're kind of the main fur trading posts in kind of the central northern Montana region. And to get all your supplies upriver to the furthest most post at Fort Benton, steamboats aren't a thing yet. They exist, but they can't get beyond Fort Union. You still have to basically manhandle a keelboat laden with several tons of supplies up a very fickle river. How many of you guys have been down the White Cliffs? Yeah, down in the Missouri Breaks. That's not exactly a great river to be hauling big wooden boats with tons of supplies. And it takes quite a bit of time. There isn't exactly Amazon Prime in the 1850s. So if you need anything fast, very valuable supplies, maybe news, messages, people, like it would help to have a very good Blackfoot interpreter if all of a sudden a group of Blackfoot show up and he's not around. So this is what the Fur Trader Express is for. It is where Benton and Union can send what they need way quicker than they can through the river route. And it's good year-round. So coming along the Fur Traders Express, they enter the Milk River Valley, and they're starting to get into Gros Ventre country. And there are not so good signs on the horizon. They meet with a group of Gros Ventre led by a man called Sits Like a Woman. Quite a great name. I love Sits Like a Woman. He's a fun character. But he informs them that there's a little bit of trouble up ahead between the Gros Ventres and the Blackfoot. They're old-time allies, both Algonquin speakers, both kind of in that northern plains region. But the Blackfoot have been getting a little pushy for the Gros Ventres. And what is more, there's a bit of a Hatfield and McCoy-like feud that's beginning to boil up, all over a love triangle. Bet you didn't know there would be romance and soap opera like drama in a program about a railroad survey. Long story short, a Blackfoot man and a Gros Ventre man fell in love with the same woman. The Blackfoot man kills the Gros Ventre man and takes the woman. She basically punches him square in the face and runs back to the Gros Ventre to tell him what's up. And like the Capulets and the Montagues, they start going to town. And this is just kind of the big flare-up that starts pushing and driving the Gros Ventre and Blackfoot apart from each other. The Gros Ventres are eventually going to seek an alliance with the Assiniboines. So if you guys know Fort Belknap Reservation, there's a reason why there's Gros Ventres and Assiniboines on there. Funny where all this knowledge comes from. And for anyone who's questioning where I got that from, it comes straight from Sits Like a Woman himself. So you can take it up with him. So Stevens starts getting ideas. And when Isaac Stevens gets ideas, it's either going to go really, really well, or it's going to blow up eventually. We'll get to that stuff later. But he has been thinking since he's been meeting with all these different tribes. He's met with the Métis, he's met with the Assiniboines, and finally he sees a perfect opportunity with the Gros Ventres. See, 2 years before in 1851, there's this little thing called the Treaty of Fort Laramie that really informs a lot of how reservations and Indian treaties are going to be handled in the future. And he sees and knows about this treaty, and he figures, I'll do it better. And with the Gros Ventres, he comes up with these ideas that's going to eventually turn into the 1855 treaties, but we'll get there. I love this portion of the expedition because he just has this wonderful description of the Gros Ventres. He was a marvelous anthropologist, which is kind of ironic considering how he is later in the story. But he has this wonderful passage where he's talking about the Gros Ventres and the expedition. They're visiting each other. They're trying to figure out, how each other are. And that night, as the sun's going down, they're all still together. A comet appears in the sky and the northern lights begin to dance just outside of modern-day Chinook, Montana. And it's this very beautiful scene of these two very different groups of people coming together to witness this beautiful natural phenomenon, just even if for a moment. So something I like to highlight a little bit. Side note, when they're in the Bear Paws, Mr. Stanley decides he's going to go out and explore a little bit. He wants to get some sketch material. Well, along the way, he gets lost, runs out of basically all of his bullets, except for one, and he finds this group of antelope somewhere near Big Sandy. And he's only got the one shot, so to get the antelope to come closer, he puts his handkerchief on a stick and starts waving it, and the antelope come closer, and sure enough, he gets one. Bada bing, bada boom, he's got dinner. He's safe. But don't you guys be getting any ideas now. I don't think FWP wants us using handkerchiefs in hunting season. But eventually, the main expedition altogether, mishaps aside, they're going to get to Fort Benton. And there's been no contact with the Western Party, so Stevens gets ideas again. He's going to wait around, but he's formulating plans to leave some men behind to further explore the area. It's September now. He's kind of getting to the antsy point where he wants to get to Washington to do his job, but he still has a lot of surveying he wants to do. On one of his little side excursions, this is Stevens right here, he's being told some very important news. But he decides, while he's at Fort Benton, I want to go see Canada. And he's most of the way up there. He's just a little bit east of the Sweetgrass Hills when an express rider from Benton comes riding up, saying that contact has been made with the Western Party. Stevens rushes back to Benton, and he starts putting his plans into full gear. So enter John Mullen. You guys have probably heard that name before. He was originally part of the river survey party for the Stevens expedition. He tags along from Fort Union out. And Stevens gradually is getting more and more impressed with Mullen, and he picks him to lead one of the detachments that's going to be left behind. He bases himself out of Cantonment Stevens, which is just south of a town that we today know as Stevensville. Let's say that again. Stevensville. Wonder where they got that name from. So Mr. Mullen is a very busy man. Starting from Cantonment Stevens, he decides he's going to head south down to Fort Hall, Idaho. Doesn't really like Idaho. He's not really that impressed with it. Very astute observer, that Mr. Mullen. But he comes back up, crossing right over Monida Pass, pretty close to where I-15 goes, follows up and down the Beaverhead River, over the pass to the headwaters of the Clark Fork, down the Clark Fork Valley, through Deer Lodge, back through the canyon to Missoula and Cantonment Stevens. What route does that sound like? Foreshadowing. He decides he's going to go back and make a couple trips to Fort Benton. He goes up the valley, over through the little Blackfoot Valley, and into literally where we're standing right now. He decides he's going to follow the Missouri River down, gets through the gates in the mountains, and decides, oh, that was a bad idea. Little does he know that the boat tours are going to be having a different opinion than him. So I guess he's not that astute of an observer. So when he gets back from Fort Benton, he decides he's going to go one valley over, back down through the Dearborn, and then follow through back to Cantonment Stevens. That sounds like a very familiar travel path as well. In the summer of 1854, he goes all the way through the Flathead Valley as far as Eureka and back down, and really has quite a lot of adventures. For those of you wonderful red-blooded Grizz fans like myself, you will recognize this view quite easily, right? Of course, it's missing an M and a beautiful little stadium down there. Maybe a marching band playing a rousing tune that's way better than the one of the blue and yellow. Sorry for all you Bobcat fans in here. I got to yank your chain a little bit. And this is kind of an example of one of the typical traveling camps for these smaller parties with Stevens. For those of you who can't tell, what do you think they've got on the spit? Yeah, they're barbecuing some ribs right there. I told you barbecue was a thing in the 1850s. This is actually a really cool image. It's from the Northwest Boundary Survey that went through the Tobacco Valley that Mullen had visited in 1854. This image dates literally just 6 years after Mullen left it. So this is about as close an image as we're going to get to something that these guys would have seen. Stanley did take daguerreotypes in Montana, but unfortunately, they were all destroyed. Fire codes. Always keep them updated, people. If I had a DeLorean, I would save those pictures. But alas, I don't. So this is a fun little side adventure from Mullen. But coming back for the last time to Cantonment Stevens, this actually took place behind my uncle's house in Missoula. But they're crossing the Clark Fork River, and these guys were great surveyors. They were not so great whitewater rafters. It's amazing nobody died on this expedition, except for one poor dude who, how do I put this? He shot himself with his own musket. The muzzle loader. How do you do that? I guess the Darwin effect was in play with him. But what can you do? But there's a couple fellows based out of Fort Benton. We'll cover the eastern side a little bit. And I love these guys because they have the funniest names on the expedition. I mean, come on. Cuvier Grover, Abiel Tinkham, and James Doty. He's the most normal of them. But from Fort Benton, Grover is going to do a boat survey all the way down to the Milk River. He complains about how awful it is to try and take a big giant wooden boat through there. I think he was probably just trying to add weight to the complaints so they'd actually build the railroad. Oh, it's awful up here. We need that railroad for sure. But he comes back to Fort Benton and he gets this genius idea to take dog sleds all the way to go see his buddy Mullen. And that's all fine and dandy for the first couple days. It's January, pretty cold, a lot of snow. They get about a day's west of modern Great Falls and the Chinook wind blows through. All of a sudden, the dogs are not too keen on dragging those sleds through the mud. They get over the pass, and it snows again. All of a sudden, it's 30 below. It's nice to know that Montana weather was crazy even 180 years ago. So Grover comes back, says hello to Mullen, then he leaves through the normal Stevens route and actually ends up taking a boat for part of the way down the Clark Fork just to see if that river was as bad as the Missouri. Again, more support for a railroad. So the next fellow is Mr. Tinkham. And Mr. Tinkham is looking for the Marias Pass. Same thing with Mr. Doty. That's the big thing they're wondering about. They've been told about the Marias Pass because it sure would be nice not to take this great big detour from modern Havre all the way down. It'd be nice to just go straight across. So they really, really want to find the Marias Pass. So Tinkham comes around following roughly what Mullen is going to do, but then goes up the Flathead and tries to find Marias Pass. He actually gets about one over. That's the tragedy of all these Marias Pass searching expeditions. They get so close, get so far. But finally he comes back down, stops and sees Mullen, and he's going to take what's called the Southern Nez Perce Trail. Have any of you guys who spent time in the Bitterroot Valley ever heard of the Magruder Corridor? That road to Elk City? Well, how do I put this? After exploration from Mr. Tinkham and a little bit of surveying of the Lolo Trail, the summation of the Southern Nez Perce Trail, that Magruder Corridor, the report says that it is the only road in the world that can make Lolo look like a good route. As someone who can't stand Highway 12 or that route, I agree. So, last and certainly not least is Mr. Doty. He does a lot of the same explorations that Grover and Tinkham have done, but his big one is going to be in the summer of 1854. He goes along the Rocky Mountain front looking for the entrance to Marias Pass. And here is the worst part about it. He finds the right one, but stops a couple miles short of the actual pass because he thinks it's not the right one. Doty, you were so close. You were so close.
So where is it? Where is Brian at?
On the map, literally right about there. They were, how do I put this? They were staring right at it. But again, tunnel vision, they're like, oh, it's that one, isn't it? When it's actually that one. And say farewell to the puppers. Of course, this is a wonderful illustration of the Flathead River as it's kind of leaving the Polson area, heading down towards St. Ignatius. And of course, anybody who's been on the east side of Glacier Park will recognize this mountain that Doty very much was struck by. Again, it's hard not to be struck by Chief Mountain if you ever see it. So, got to include Chief. But Sweetgrass Hill is another big, big marker in the region. So, when Doty leaves, this really ends the smaller parties left behind by Stevens. This is sort of the official end of the surveys. Of course, Stevens, this whole time, he's been sitting nice and happy in Tacoma, Washington, writing letters back, trumpeting the success of the Pacific Railroad survey up in the north, begging Davis for more money. Davis writes back saying, no, you've already spent all the money I'm willing to give you. Do not ask for more. But he starts talking about this crazy idea of building a wagon road off of Mullen's work. I wonder what they're going to do with that. But he's also finalizing that grand idea that began somewhere along the Milk River, the 1855 treaties. Now, this is the not so fun and adventurous portion of the program. And most of these images are going to be done by Gustav Sohan, who was one of Mullen's associates. So this depicts one of the actual treaty proceedings. He starts in the spring of 1855 with the coastal tribes in Washington, moves on towards the Central Plateau tribes like the Yakimas, the Walla Wallas, and the Nez Perce. This image is from that treaty. In July, he does one outside of Missoula with the Salish, the Kootenai, and the Pend Oreille. And finally, he finishes off in October with the Blackfoot Treaty. They were initially hoping to do that in August, but low water had prevented the treaty annuities from coming up, so they had to delay. But a little background on the treaties. Essentially put, Stevens has the route for the railroad. Now he needs the land. Only one problem. There are people on the land who are not really happy about the idea of giving it up. And so his plan with the treaties, essentially give up claim to a portion of your land. You'll guarantee rights to a certain portion of it. But in exchange, we'll give you government annuities. We'll make payments of food, of clothing, of materials. We'll build schools to teach your children. We'll teach you trades. We will make you like us so that when the railroad comes, why, there's no obstacle. I think the following individual said it best when dealing with the treaties. This is from Kyopyo Max, a Walla Walla chief. He's a descendant of one of the chiefs that had welcomed Lewis and Clark with open arms. We have listened to all you have to say, and we desire you should listen when any Indian speaks. It appears you want an answer immediately without giving us time to think. We have not seen in a true light the object of your speeches. I think you intend to win our country. You have spoken in a way partly tending to evil. Speak plain to us. The curious anthropologist, the go-ahead man, has a dark side. My way or the highway, or in this case, my way or the railroad. Stevens is pushy. He's not waiting for the answer. He's not encouraging debate. There is no debate. These are my terms. Accept them and move on. Some of these chiefs had considered Stevens a friend when they met him. They're shocked by the person that stands before them 2 years later. Again, he doesn't want to listen. He doesn't want to give them time to have their input. It's my way or no way at all. Again, he's a young man in a hurry, and he's hurrying through this with tragic consequences. So this is a sketch depicting the Missoula Council. It's a lovely state park that has been preserved quite well. You can actually visit it. And it's much the same. And this is the Blackfoot Council as well. So Stevens finishes up the Blackfoot Council, and he thinks everything's all hunky-dory. He gets back to Fort Benton, and he has another urgent message waiting for him. There is war in the Northwest. Not 6 months later, the coastal tribes are rising up against the treaties. The plateau tribes, the Yakimas in particular, are rising up against the treaties. See, the people of Washington and Oregon hear word of these treaties and think, well, they've signed the treaty, they've given it up, it's ours now. Imagine if I moved into your living room 5 minutes after you said that I'll consider letting someone rent my extra space. How would you feel? Probably pretty bad. Of course, that's a very basic comparison, but it's quite the same. I had a little girl ask a question very similar, and I used that analogy, and you could see the lights go off upstairs like, oh. And of course, the war in the Northwest, it's chaotic. It could have a program of its own. But essentially, Stevens rushes back and begins the process of dealing with these insurrections and rebellions, if you will. Amongst some of the things going on, Stevens raises what's effectively a private army, starts going after political opponents, butts heads with the territorial militia, butts heads with the United States regular army. All of them are saying the same thing. Calm down, Isaac. Quit doing things. Quit trying to help. You're only making it worse. Just to give you an example of some of the chaos and the atrocities that are going on, Pio Pio Mux Mux, that fellow that had the quote there at the treaties, he gives himself up to a group of militia, hoping that this is going to show that the Walla Wallas are peaceful. We don't want to fight. For his brave act, Pio Pio Mux Mux is summarily executed and turned into razor strops by those militiamen. So with all this chaos, with all that's going on, Stevens kind of sees the writing on the wall. This isn't going well for me. I need to sort of create a safe position for myself once I'm no longer in control as governor. So he pardons himself. Delightful man, that Isaac Stevens. But the Northwest is not the only place that's in chaos in 1856. Flashback towards our fellow Franklin and their mutual acquaintance, Stephen Douglas. Douglas has this bright idea, not for a Pacific Railroad, but for this little thing called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Well, if the people of the West can't decide if they want to be slave or free, we shouldn't do it for them. Let them vote. They'll decide themselves. What you get is a mini Civil War in Kansas, 5 years before the actual Civil War. So Stevens has created a mess. Pierce has created a mess. And we are all of a sudden catapulting down the hillside towards something really awful. In all this chaos with Kansas and Nebraska, with all the tension going on, a Pacific Railroad is not going to be finished or passed. There's deadlock. No one can agree with anybody else, so the idea is effectively killed. Of course, the biggest thing that does that comes in 1861, the Civil War. And Isaac Stevens is a lot of things. Not all good, not all bad. But one thing he is an ardent American patriot. And when war comes, he volunteers his services and rises to become a major, well, a brigadier general, but he's on the cusp of being a major general, but something happens. He actually serves under McClellan. And it's kind of funny, but McClellan seems to have very purposefully shoehorned Stevens into some of the less than ideal situations. Moral of the story, be careful of who you make mad at work. So another funny little side note here. Notice how Stevens is the only one sitting down? There are no photos of him just purely standing up in a crowd. There's one photo I've been able to track down of him standing. Oh, it's funny. But he's always sitting, so you can't tell how tall or short he is compared to everybody else. So,
But he was short.
smart guy. Again, 5'3" in boots. But Stevens, this is kind of the low point of the Northern Railroad. September 1st, 1862, Stevens is at the head of his brigade. It's looking pretty grim for the boys in blue. The Confederates are rallying. They're about to push through and basically collapse this chunk of the army. Stevens, seeing what is going on, he picks up a fallen American flag, turns to his men, shouts, "Boys, follow your general." Takes 3 steps forward and dies immediately. And that is the end of our, I shouldn't say friend, but protagonist. And it is the low point of the railroad. Its greatest champion and supporter is dead in a Virginia field. But there is a bright side to the Civil War. With the southern states gone, the northern senators and representatives can pass a bill that provides for a Pacific Railroad that's going to be located north of the Mason-Dixon. Maybe you might want to think about that the next time you guys rebel. They might move your railroad from you. And by 1869, there is indeed a transcontinental railroad. The iron dream has been realized with one singular golden spike. And it's going to take a little bit longer for those iron rails to reach Montana, but eventually they will reach us. First one shows up in Butte in 1881, almost 30 years after the Pacific Railroad surveys. The golden spike for the Northern Pacific is laid right outside of Gold Creek. And again, 30 years have gone by. But the Northern Pacific utilizes chunks that were surveyed by Mullen. The next one that comes close to our area is the Canadian Pacific, and that's a tangent in and of itself. But northern Montana, the actual Stevens route, is going to have to wait until 1886 and 1893 for the Montana Central and Great Northern to utilize the routes that had been surveyed. And the Great Northern, they're the ones who finally figure out where the heck this Marias Pass is. So, unfortunately for all of us from Great Falls, yeah, I could do a whole other tangent on my feelings or lack thereof for J.J. Hill, but that's another night. So this is sort of my own compilation of all the various routes and side tangents that people associated with the Stevens expedition undertook. The light blue is the main track of the main part of the expedition, so that's the one bringing up the odometer wagon. But all this other blue was surveyed at one time or another by people like Mullen, Doty, Tinkham, Grover. All those people contribute to this map. And those of you who know can kind of close their eyes and imagine a highway map of Montana, how much of that matches up? So this is really where the impactful stuff of this expedition really comes to a head for me. My parents run transportation services. They're delivery people. They operate off of roads every day. It's something near and dear to my heart. It literally is the reason why I exist. My parents met at UPS. So needless to say, doing a historical program on transportation route, I guess it was fated. But routes like the Great Northern follows most of the Stevens route. Parts of the Northern Pacific. They're still used, that track today. Thousands and thousands of tons of material moves across railroads that originally were plotted out and theorized in the 1850s. Again, to this day, railroads are the best form of land freight transportation. You can move things in bulk quicker and cheaper than anything else, even a truck. In fact, fun fact for you, most of those trucks you see at some point, those trailer compartments, that freight was moved by a railroad. We're still dependent on the Iron Dream. It's also the part or whole of over 20 different county, state, and federal highways and interstates in Montana. I-15 and the chunk of I-90 from Butte all the way through to the end of its run in Montana, that's Mullen. That's stuff that he surveyed while under Stevens in 1854. Highway 2, if you've ever been along the High Line, that's the old Fur Traders Express. 87 from Havre to Great Falls. Highway 200, the longest continuous state highway in the country, a lot of that is Stevens. It was the road to the Buffalo used by the Salish and Nez Perce before, but they're the ones who wrote it down and plotted it out on a map. So, yeah. But this is what really fascinates me about this expedition. And the treaties. They have their dark sides, yes, but those treaties are the basis of hunting and fishing rights on reservations across the Northwest. Bits and pieces of those treaties are still in tribal law to this day, preserving the rights, heritage, and culture of people that it was meant to effectively herd. Funny how history flips. But for me, we're going to go back to where it begins with this painting. It's an expedition that has no monuments. There are a couple little monuments for the Mullen Road, but nothing directly for Stevens and that expedition, which I'm not saying we need to build a statue for the guy, but you know, it's something that isn't commemorated. The trail of the Stevens expedition, there's no national scenic trail for it. Tourists don't flock to Montana every year to spend their money, you know, going down like they do with the Lewis and Clark Trail. And that's another thing. While so many of these routes, these expeditions, the paths they followed are no longer used, this is one that's very much alive. There's a reason you can still see Oregon Trail wagon ruts. They stopped using it. There's a reason why you need to charter a guide to go down the White Cliffs for 3 days and disappear into the breaks to follow Lewis and Clark. You don't need that for Stevens and that expedition, because literally this very evening, you guys are walking in the footsteps of that expedition. It is in the roads, in the railroads that are used every single day by thousands of Montanans all across this state. And for me, that's a legacy worth remembering. For all the good, for all the bad, I think it's something that we should talk more about and remember. So, with that, guys, some sources and further reading. You can actually check out Isaac Stevens' papers at the University of Washington. You can just feel the pure, But you can actually read the original survey reports as well as the treaties. That was the bulk of the information that I used to develop this program. And with that, thank you very much.
So we do have time for questions. Because we're filming this, I'm going to have you raise your hand, and I'll bring you the mic, and you can speak into the mic so that people watching on YouTube can hear the questions.
Well, it sounds to me like Stevens didn't spend any time on the actual trail. You said he was in Tacoma in 1853.
He was along for the entire ride from St. Paul all the way across. He just didn't stay behind to do all those side trips and little adventures that Mullen and Doty and the others were doing. Right after he got word that the two survey parties had met and made contact, he moves ahead, basically following the route that he wanted to go with the main body of the expedition. They just leave behind the smaller groups. So he does go the whole way. He actually is out there on the surveys. So, yep. So.
When the books show up in Congress in like 1860,
Yeah.
what is the response Congress has to that?
Basically, the response is along the lines of, cool, thank you very much, we have more important things to worry about. Nice read. Some of the opinions on Stevens's report particularly thought he was a bit too optimistic and bombastic in his support for the northern route. Even some of the people under him thought he was kind of overselling it a little bit. Doty was kind of tongue-in-cheek, like, yeah, he's kind of stretching the truth a little bit. It's not that good of a route. It's good, but it's not that good. But yeah, so it was kind of a kind of reception at the time. Because again, you're a year away from the Civil War. There's a lot more chaotic stuff going on. The people in Washington, D.C. don't necessarily really care too much about little old Washington territory at the time.
As they progressed west, did Stevens act as governor as well? And I know that he declared Stevensville area a capital. Did he do that in other places?
So his first act as governor of Washington Territory was when they crossed the Continental Divide. They stopped just long enough for Stevens to wish the expedition a warm welcome to his home and to his territory. It's like, thanks guys, you've been doing all the work to get me here, but welcome to my pad. It sure is nice. So.
So did he then go over Stevens Pass, and when
Stevens
was
Pass
that
in Washington,
named?
that wasn't him. So, might have been named for him. I don't know too much about the western chunk of the surveys beyond what I researched for this. I mainly was focusing on the eastern expedition. I did love diving through McClellan just for that barbecue quote. Like, I saw that, I'm like, oh my goodness, I may have to rethink my opinion of you, George. Just kidding, but yeah. But Stevens, after he got to Washington, he didn't do any more exploring on his own. He quite very much, he basically sunk into his role as governor and Indian commissioner. So after he got to Washington, it was all treaties, all getting the territory squared away. Exploration, that's for his little underlings. Any more?
Well, I'm curious about how much intelligence the surveyors took from the indigenous people who were here. How much research did they do, and how much, yeah.
Well, the entire time they were going up the Milk River Valley, Stevens is talking with Sits Like a Woman and the Culbertsons to learn as much as he can about some of the tribal dynamics. He actually searches out a couple times different tribal groups, like he sends Mullen after the Salish to try and talk with them a little bit. I know Mullen talks with them to figure out some ideas of where to go and whatnot, but for the most part, they're operating off of the topography as they're going with what little they have available to them. So, and they try a couple different routes as well, regardless of what people tell them, just so they can determine for themselves, like, is this good for a railroad or not? Because some routes are great for like horses, some routes are great for wagons. Not all of them are great for a railroad. So it's all about grades and things like that.
Do they have Thompson's surveys and information?
Oh, geez. David Thompson.
Yeah.
Oh, David Thompson. When was his material published? I don't think his material was published in his lifetime is the problem. The Hudson Bay Company basically lorded over that information.
So they,
So I don't know if Stevens had any access to that, actually. Which it really wouldn't have done him a whole lot of good except for the chunk in the Columbia. But there was already work that had been done between Lewis and Clark with some of the lower portions of the Columbia drainage. So that's an interesting one I'm going to research more.
Are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.